Thank you, Olivia, and thank you for coming, ladies and gentlemen. I think I'd better begin by introducing you to Bill Fisk. Second Lieutenant Bill Fisk, 12th Battalion, King's Liverpool Regiment. He's not my grandfather or my great-grandfather, he's my dad. He was born in 1899, much older than my mum, who wasn't even alive, wanted desperately to join his friends in the First World War in the trenches, tried to join up underage in 1914 when he was only 15 years old. My grandma, whom I never met, went to Preston and told them Dad was lying. He managed to get into the army at 17 and joined, first of all, the Cheshire Regiment. In fact, I'm going to hand these pictures round so you can actually look at them rather than stare at a screen. In fact, he was uniquely saved from the First Battle of the Somme, 1st of July 1916, 20,000 British and Commonwealth dead in one day, where I'm sure he would have been among them because he was a patriotic, keen young Englishman. Thank God for Podrick Pearce, I always say, who started a rising in Dublin in Easter 1916, and Dad was sent to Ireland. Thanks be to God. Eventually, he got his will, he got a transfer to the King's Liverpool Regiment, and arrived in Arras, on the Somme. Here he is in Arras, in August of 1918. He had 3.5 months to run of the war. Interesting, this is a pal of his, unidentified forever, we'll never know who he is, and he's reading a book. And I always look for sort of little social things in photographs. Because this, by the way, in Beirut, I've tried to use computers to enhance this to see what he was reading. And I can't find out. We can't read it. None of us can. I've got the best computer guy in Lebanon. He can't bring the print up. But it's interesting because this was the first time in our history that we sent a literate army to war. These soldiers could read and write, and so could their families. I often think that one of the reasons we didn't tip them all into mass graves, as we did at Waterloo and other major battles, Marlborough and Spain, is because the families would be able to read their tombstones, so they had an individuality through reading and writing. And I wonder if that didn't play a part. I don't know, but I often think it. So there's Bill, who could also read and write. In fact, I can tell you that Bill was put in charge of the war diary of the King's Liverpool Regiment. So not only, if I can find it here, not only do I have memory of him talking to me in his photographs, but I also have his diary recording this afternoon 100 years ago, exactly where he was. And I can tell you, he was about to lead his men in 2.25 hours' time, 100 years ago, into a small French village called Louvencourt on the Somme. So we can track him through the afternoon from the records, which I have here, in his own handwriting. Anyway, Bill, I think in the First World War, and I have good reason to believe it, here's Bill behind the lines, a day off from the trenches. He's in his puttees, you see, because, of course, that was to protect your legs from the mud in the trenches. And here he is. That's the kit issue for a gas mask, your satchel you put over your shoulder, always carry a gas mask. And here's a lady's straw hat on the tree. She is presumably taking the photograph. And just beneath it is a little box which must have been his camera. Bill Fisk took a camera to the First World War, state of the art, a box camera, a little tiny one. And I've got all his prints. And the amazing thing about it is, it was only when I went back to Louvencourt to find his house and knock on the front door, his billet, that the BBC producer who was with me, a lady, she said, "Robert, you know your dad was a reporter, wasn't he? He took a camera to the First World War. He filmed the Somme." And I suddenly thought, God, I never thought of that before my whole life. He did. Anyway, I'm going to start, if you put the pictures around in rows, you can have a look at them. Look, we'll start off with Phil in uniform, I think, before we put him out. As for the lady, I don't know her name. Obviously, she didn't last. But when my father died, aged 93, in 1992, my mum, who was already dying of the effects of Parkinson's, told me to take his steel box where he put his insurance papers, last letters, etc. And there was a letter to my mother, Peggy, thanking her for her unwavering love throughout his life. A letter to me, which he signed King Billy, which was my rather way of bringing him down to size when he became a rather dictatorial old man, very racist in his language. And at the bottom of the tin were 2 tickets to the horses at Longchamp. And my mother said, "Throw them away." She wasn't even alive in 1918, but he kept the tickets. So, of course, I put them in the waste bin, and when my mother went to bed, I took them out. But Bill did do one thing. He decided he would take a picture of the Somme. He told me, in the trench, he put his hand up quickly like that and did it once more, which is why the picture is not very good, but it's the Somme. That's the real thing. Wow. Taken just over 100 years ago this weekend. And you can see the shell-blasted trees. This is obviously the top rampart of the British trench. The Germans are over here. The next picture is clearer but less brave. You've only got the top of the British trench. The Germans are over here. And I think probably there were so many bullets flying around. And I, of course, experienced this personally in the Middle East. That's about the picture I probably would have taken. When I go to Syria, my wife comes with me. She always says she doesn't want to be sitting at home and get a phone call, I've got bad news, but if she sees me sitting next to her, she knows I'm okay. And when we are in front lines in Syria, where there are real bullets today flying around, I always say to her, I quote Churchill, not my great hero, but I quote Churchill, who used to say, there is nothing so satisfying as to be shot at without effect. To which my wife, who is as intelligent as she is young and beautiful, always says, Robert, forget Churchill, it is much better not to be shot at. Anyway, Bill even got a mate of his to take a picture of him on White Sox, his horse. Not a great picture because Bill's riding off. That's White Sox though. On the original photo, he's actually named White Sox as the horse, so I know he's on that one. Here's a lovely photo he got taken of his company in the King's Liverpool Regiment. You can see all the faces clearly. This, of course, is not colourised. That's the computer makes the blue on it. But you can see the faces. Bill, when the picture comes through, he's the guy sitting down here without his hat on, right at the front. But you look at those soldiers. How many survived? I don't know. If you go back a little bit in the war diary he wrote, he actually lists the names of all these soldiers who died that night, just putting the names down, get them in order. There you go. It's a lovely photo, that one. Here he is when he was playing football in Ireland with Sinn Féin. It probably wasn't a wise thing to do, but this is during the First World War, but before he got to France. There you are. His battalion went on parade for the French president one day after the ceasefire. This is tomorrow, 100 years ago. It was already snowing. Good picture he took on that one, by the way. He actually obviously stood in front of the soldiers. And here are his friends who wrote to him when he was in Ireland, asking him to join them in France. And he told me that every one of them was killed. We don't know their names. He didn't write the names on the back. This man actually has the look, I always think, of what Wilfred Owen called doomed youth. It's a guy who's going to die, isn't he? And look at the age of these guys. I don't think they're more than 16 years old. I doubt it very much. And this lonely man, we do have on the side of it, yours, Trevor. But he died, presumably before Bill got there. And you're going to look off the pictures when they reach the back. 13 in all, in case any go missing. In any event, I think I used to tell Bill this when I was coming to his home from the Middle East. I used to tell him that in the 17 months that followed his war, we, the victors, primarily of course Britain and France, drew the borders of Northern Ireland, Yugoslavia, and most of the modern Middle East. And I have spent my entire career as a journalist, Belfast, Belgrade, Beirut, Baghdad, onomatopoeias great, Damascus, watching the people in those borders burn. And for those people, and remember, Syria was effectively a colonial project of the French mandate. It was the French who divided Lebanon off from Syria and gave it to the Christians, and look what that brought us. And these people, I believe today, are still living the First World War. And I have not seen a single reference in any newspaper since Thursday which mentions the Middle East. Didn't Gallipoli happen there? Weren't we fighting a Muslim army in Gallipoli? Wasn't Mustafa Kemal Ataturk at Gallipoli? Ataturk, by the way, had a lot in common with things which the Nazis liked. He purified his country racially. He got rid of the Armenians in the first Holocaust, industrial Holocaust, of the last century. And it's interesting, and I'm going to ask you, own up. No, don't own up, because you can't. Anyone here today, on this day of all days, has remembered the Armenian Genocide, the greatest war crime committed by anyone in the First World War, the deliberate genocide mass murder of 1.5 million Armenian Christians? Hands up anyone who thought of them today. You, 2, 3, 4. Bloody good. Would you be Armenian by any chance?
No, I'm not.
Okay, fine. Because usually the person who puts their hand up when asks the question is. No. Why don't we remember the Armenians? When they asked for help from Britain, they were told in the Foreign Office, our battleships don't climb mountains. Which is true, but not quite good enough. The odd thing is, but there's no commemoration apart from their own on April 24th, 25th. You know, I go to it in the Middle East, sometimes in Lebanon, or even in Istanbul. What flowers do we put on our lapel for the Armenians? Plenty of poppies in the Middle East, but they tend to be pink rather than Flanders red. And I always think, you know, I've walked the deserts in northern Syria where their bones still lie there. You can see femurs and bits of skull. And I always think that perhaps the thorn bush, which is covering the area, might be a little thing to put on your lapel on November the 11th for the greatest civilian war crimes of the First World War. The problem, of course, is if you touch it, it will prick your finger and it will bleed real blood. So, well, let's carry on with the First World War. Who thought of Lord Balfour today? Or Mr. Balfour, as he was, when he signed his declaration in 1917. Who thought of Mr. Sykes, Mark Sykes, and Georges François Picot? Good, excellent, but not many. 2. Oof. But these are the people who keep the First World War running where I live. When a Palestinian wakes up in the dust and dirt of Ain al-Helwi camp, Sidon, Nahr al-Bared in Tripoli, Sabra Shatila in Beirut, for him, Balfour signed the declaration last night, and he is living directly the effects of the First World War. Because one of the reasons for the Balfour Declaration of Britain's support for a Jewish homeland in Palestine, not, of course, to interfere with the existing communities, which is what Balfour referred to the vast majority of people who were Muslims and Christians in that area. When he did that, that was a specific intention of bringing the Jews of Russia and the Jews of Germany, who were in the German army, of course, and the Jews of America firmly onto the Allied side, at least in their thinking. It was a First World War project. And I have just been in the West Bank looking at the results of that project and watching about 300 Palestinians waiting to be evicted from the Khan al-Ahmar camp because of the First World War, because of my dad, although he wouldn't want to take personal responsibility and I wouldn't give it to him, I wouldn't suggest it. But there you go. So, why has 1914-18 kept its centrality in our lives? I always think that, in fact, it should be World War II, because the names are so easy, aren't they? I mean, the fall of France, the Battle of Britain, Stalingrad, Dresden, Hamburg, El Alamein, I mean, Iwo Jima. We remember the Somme and Passchendaele, but, or Ypres as a name, or Wipers as it was called. By the way, the British Army called Charleroi Charlie Roy, I discovered on a visit there. Got it about right if you think about it, and in Old French it would have been. But when I always think it should be the Second War that we're thinking about. We still have survivors among us, and people here who remember as children the Second World War. But it always goes back to the first. It goes back somehow to Bill. Doom-like quality, I always think, the Somme, sombre, Somme. There's a reference in Henry V to the Somme, and I always shiver a bit when I suddenly see it there. It had something was touching Shakespeare too, you know. And I don't know, Passchendaele. I mean, could a name like Passchendaele, which most people find utterly unspellable, could it have a more resonance than the use of the word passion from the English language? Let me give you an example. Frederick Manning, a sinister account by him of British troops moving up to the Somme at night marching through a tiny French village to the sadness and consternation of the few French men and women still awake who came to the door. Doors suddenly opened and light fell through the doorways, and voices asked the soldiers where they were going. Somme, 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 they shouted, as though it were a challenge. Ah, no bon, came the kindly, pitying voices in reply. And that was an enemy to them, that little touch of gentleness and kindness. It struck them with a hand harsher than death's, and they sang louder, seeing only the white road beyond them. Somme, Somme, Somme. The name speaks, doesn't it, of sacrifice on a monstrous, epic scale, the destruction of youth. Even today, semantics and linguistics have maintained the relationship of us with these men. Their language, their expressions, their horror, the very metaphors they use are contemporary. They are as if of now. You don't need colorized film. Just read the words. They're our people, yours and mine. The soldier poet Edmund Blunden, writing 103 years ago, sounds equally contemporary for us. One morning, dark and liquid and wild, Colonel Harrison and a number of us went off in a lorry to reconnoitre in Ypres proper and to visit the trenches we were to hold. The sad salient lay under a heavy silence, broken here and there by the ponderous muffled thump of trench mortar shells round the line. We passed big houses, one or two, glimmering whitely, life and death. We found light come by the time we passed a famous asylum, a red ruin with some buildings and ornaments still surviving over its doorway. There was in the town itself the same strange silence, and the staring pallor of the streets in that daybreak was unlike anything I had known. The Middle Ages had here contrived to lurk, and this was their torture at last. We all felt this, as the tattered picture swung by like accidents of vision. God, this guy can write. And when we got out of the lorry by the Menin Gate, that unlovely hiatus, we scarcely seemed awake and aware. Blunden, I think, he tricks us into understanding the sad salient, the ruined houses glimmering whitely, like the white road stretching out before Manning soldiers going to the Somme, the staring pallor of the streets, the accidents of vision, the unlovely hiatus. What a wonderful, to the present Menin Gate, what a wonderful description. Its literature, I think, sharpened by fear and weariness. And I can tell you, because I went through more war than my dad ever did, that the greatest danger to you when you cover wars is tiredness. You've got to be alert all the time. In Syria, for example, you can spend 12 hours in the desert on the front line. You get all the way back to somewhere where you can get a bed, and then you've got to write, and you get about 4 hours sleep, and off you go again. And that is the greatest danger. You're getting back in the car, and you've got to keep your wits about you, and you're so tired. And if you read a lot of stories of punishments in the British Army, it's for soldiers and sentries who fell asleep, even amid bombardments. War makes you tired before it kills you. It seems extraordinary today that a woman also wrote from the Western Front under fire. Margot Asquith, wife of British Prime Minister Herbert Asquith, wangled permission to visit Ypres on the front line in 1914. Few even realise that a woman did record events at this time. But here is her sad and painful description of the graves cluttering the Ypres cemetery and of the German bombardment of the city. The Ypres cemetery will haunt me forever. No hospital of wounded or dying men could have given me a greater insight into the waste of war than that dripping, gaunt and crowded churchyard. There were broken bits of wood stuck in the grass at the head of hundreds of huddled graves. God, she can write. With English names scrawled upon them in pencil. Where the names had been washed off, forage caps were hanging, and they were all placed one against the other as closely as possible. I saw a Tommy digging and said, "Who's that grave for?" And he didn't stop or look at me. He answered for the next one. Thin white lines of smoke, like poplars in a row, stood out against the horizon, and I saw the flash of every German gun. My companions said that if the shells had been coming our way, they would have gone over our heads. All soldiers tell you that, by the way. The German troops, he explained, must have come on unknown to them in the night, and he added that he did not think that either the Belgians, the British or the French knew at all what they were up to. So far as I can discover, this passage is the first indication in prose during the Great War, the very first hint that chaos rather than order might decide the coming bloodbath. And it was a non-military writer, a woman of course, who understood the significance of this. But again, we have that wonderful metaphor from the heart of literary tradition of the shell explosion standing like poplars in a row. Spot on, I can tell you from first-hand experience, that's what it looks like. Interestingly, Guillaume Apollinaire, whom we think of as a poet and forget that he was a French poilu in the trenches, he found a strangely similar metaphor when he described shellfire near Nîmes 4 months later in January of 1915. And then my memory would fade as a shell blooms, bursting over the front line, magnificent, like mimosa in bloom, or mimosa en fleur, a beautiful expression. But I find personally that unless I'm hunting into hitherto unread poetry, particularly by Irish soldiers, by the way, there is now a whole book of Irish war poetry which you can buy in Dublin, I find that the poetry of the Great War no longer seizes hold of me in the same way as prose does. Perhaps we've overused Rupert Brooke and Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon. It's a bit like, Beethoven's Fifth is great, but we've really heard it rather a lot. Or, Tchaikovsky's 1812, or, Handel's Water Music. There is a limit to which you can keep taking this, even on the radio. And I think the same has happened with poetry of the First War. Everyone suddenly burst out singing. We're all familiar with Wilfred Owen's froth-corrupted lungs, aren't we? Corner of a foreign field that is forever England in that earth of richer dust. I think now it's as if poetry has somehow been used up, maybe to await another generation who would read it, or who might read it. I could say the same of the prose. Bill Fisk every year would take me back to his battlefields, to the Somme, to Ypres where he did not fight, and to Verdun to show me what happened to the French. He had a rather odd view of Pétain for obvious reasons. Bill first brought me to Ypres in 1956 when I was just 10 years old. We stayed at a dreadful hotel called the Old Tom Hotel with lots of First World War veterans whom little 10-year-old Robert went to talk to because I wanted to be a journalist by the time I was 12 and I was interested in these guys. They were quite young, of course, World War I veterans. When I went back to give a lecture at for the Armistice at the Ypres Cloth Hall, rebuilt some years ago, I asked to stay at the Old Tom Hotel. And I can tell you, should you visit Ypres, it is still there, and it is just as awful as ever. Bill got filled with a kind of strange patriotism mixed with a kind of bleak but soldierly sorrow when he toured the cemeteries. There is at Ypres, by the way, a Robert Fisk, dead, of course, no relative at all, but the name is spelled exactly the same. In later years, when Bill understood the mendacity of General Haig and read in silence the growing number of books about those soldiers who had been put before the firing squad, his mood changed. He refused anymore to wear a poppy. So did I. Once, when he was very old and recovering from a cancer operation, I went to see him in the private hospital where he was recovering, and I asked him the questions that historians have still not been able to answer. What on earth was the Great War about? We know what it did to the Middle East, but what was it about? All it was, fella, he replied to me. I should explain that Bill loved the book Beau Geste by P.C. Wren, in which one of the lead characters is always referred to as fella. My father never realised that Fala is an Arabic name, and he was calling me Fala when I was 10. I was going to spend most of the rest of my life in the Middle East. In any event, he said, all it was, Fala, was just one great waste, he said. The very words of Waldo Asquith. And I understood him. As a Middle East correspondent, I've covered many wars. And one of them was the 8-year war between Iran and Iraq, a titanic conflict of First World War proportions. Its battles fought not only in the deserts beneath a sun that burned like a sword, a great expression of Lawrence of Arabia, by the way, but amid the glutinous muck of water and earth, which I once described in a dispatch from the Iran-Iraq War as Somme like mud. Much did I know. Almost 1.5 million men died there. Looking back now, I see how even my own reports from that awful war reflect the language of the Great War, albeit I could never reach the passion of language, and thankfully never share the terror and pain of those soldiers. When I look back as a journalist on my own reports of those terrible battles, the influence of 1914-18 obviously did infect my own language. In the summer of 1985, the Iranian Army and Revolutionary Guards had stormed across the Shatt al-Arab River, once seized by British troops in 1915, and then again in 2003. My God, how we go eating away at our own history, don't we? And the Iranians captured the Iraqi peninsula of Fal. They had inflicted great slaughter on the Iraqis, whose dead soldiers lay in the mud, newly killed around us. Here's my brief, short extract from a report I wrote that day. I see another body in a gun pit, a young man in the fetal position, curled up like a child, already blackening with death, but with a wedding ring on his finger. I am mesmerised by the ring. On this hot, golden morning, it glitters and sparkles with freshness and life. He has black hair and is around 25 years old. Or should that be, was around 25 years old. Do we stop the clock when death surprises us? Do we say, Binion, I quote him, they shall grow not old as we that are left grow old. Age may not weary them, nor the years condemn. But, I went back into myself here, their humanity is quickly taken from their remains by the swiftness of corruption and the jolly old sun. I look again at the ring. An arranged marriage or a love match? Where was he from, this soldier corpse? His wife? His wife? He could not be more than 3 days dead. Somewhere to the north of us, his wife is waking the children, making breakfast, glancing at her husband's photograph on the wall, unaware that she is already a widow, and that her husband's wedding ring, so bright with love for her on this glorious morning, embraces a dead finger. It's not just the deliberate quotation from Binion's spiritual resurrection, of course, for the dead. The jolly old sun, I suspect, was a memory of mine out there in the desert in 1985 of Wilfred Owen's futility. Move him into the sun, Owen wrote in his poem of a dead soldier's corpse. If anything might raise him now, the kind old sun will know. The kind old sun became the jolly old sun. I must have been thinking of Owen. Which was answer of a kind to the question I asked my dad. Yet even Wyndham Lewis, the master of vorticist art, who became a soldier at Ypres, found it difficult to explain what the Great War represented for him, albeit that his attempts to do so were of a remarkable eloquence. The war, he said, was such a tremendous landmark that locally it imposes itself upon our computations of time like the birth of Christ. Everything is pre-war or post-war, rather, as we say, BC or AD. In his autobiography, he wrote about a little group of people crossing a bridge. He's talking about the First World War. The bridge is red. The people are red. The sky is red. Of course, the bridge is symbolic. The bridge stands for something else. The bridge, you see, is the war. Upon one side of the bridge is a quite different landscape to what meets the eye upon the other side, as if the stream spanned by the bridge separated a tropic from a polar landscape. And the principal figure among those crossing this little bridge, that is me, said Wyndham Lewis, does not know that he is crossing anything at all, from one world into another. Indeed, everybody else seems to know it except him. He does not see the cold stream. He scarcely sees his companions, yet he is not a sleepwalker. He has his eye fixed upon a small red bird, upon a red bough within a large red tree. Pretty, isn't it? When he comes to reflect upon the war afterwards, who would object to these conclusions? The war, Wyndham Lewis wrote, went on far too long, or too long for a totalitarian war, as it would now be called. It was too vast for its meaning, like a giant with the brain of a midge. Its epic proportions were grotesquely out of scale, seeing what it was fought to settle. It was far too indecisive. It settled nothing, as it meant nothing. Indeed, it was impossible to escape the feeling that it was not meant to settle anything. I think he's probably got it there. That could have any meaning or be of any advantage to the general run of men. Here, I think, we face the truth that Bill tried to confront, that the war in which he fought was finally for him devoid of meaning. He was lucky to have served on the Western Front for only 3.5 months. Thank God he was sent to Ireland after 1916. Thank God for Padraig Pearse. But I think Bill felt the lack of human purpose, which the Great War represented. At the end of the war, he was asked to execute a soldier who had shot, he told me, a French gendarme. I've tracked down the soldier. He was an Australian who had stupidly joined the Royal Artillery after being taken sick in Gallipoli. As a British soldier, he could be shot. No Australians could be. And he didn't shoot a French gendarme. He shot a British military policeman in Paris. Papier, monsieur. And the guy pulled out a gun, drunk, and shot him. I have all the papers. His mother was never told that he was shot at a stake. But my father was told to execute him, and he refused. And he was immediately put on a charge, and that was the end of his military career. He wanted to join the Gurkhas and go to India and be an officer. Well, that was the end of Bill. Looking back now on the old man who used to speak in very racist terms and whom I came to despise very much in his old age, I think it was the finest thing he ever did. But he also used to tell me, and I'm sure he meant it, that he went to war for little Catholic Belgium. He really believed that, because it was cruelly overrun in 1914, all but the bit around Ypres, of course, by the men he collectively referred to as the Hun or the Boche in his postcards back to his mum and dad. He talked of German atrocities in the villages around Louvain and in the city itself, which, by the way, we know war crimes were committed. They did butcher women. The German army did commit war crimes, not the rape and crucifixion of nuns, as was claimed at the time, but there were war crimes committed by the Germans in 1914. My father, needless to say, regarded the Irish, whom he was sent to suppress, as cowards and traitors, while the Irish patriots would, for decades to come, see their own brothers who fought in British uniform as traitors of a worse kind. The nationalist tragedies and civil conflicts set off by the Great War, not least in Germany itself, were to reverberate for decades to come. Because my PhD is in Irish neutrality in the Second World War, I often give academic lectures at Irish universities. And it's very interesting to see how the mood has almost totally changed. And there's a great deal of sympathy for Britain alone. Only alone. I think once the tide changed, the sympathies died up a lot during the war. But it's interesting to see that change coming. The other day, the Irish lamented the loss of the RMS Leinster with more than 200 dead. It set out from Dunleary, which would then have been called Kingstown, and was sunk by a German submarine, which promptly hit a mine and sunk with all hands. And it's interesting to note that the ship was obviously going to Holyhead. It was the mail packet, the regular daily run, on the hour at the same time. Thank you, U-boat captains, please note, right? And the mayor of Holyhead, which of course was the other side, and many Holyhead men were on board. It was a posting office also. The Dublin postman was sorting mail for the rest of the UK, because Ireland was still in the UK then, of course. And it's interesting that the mayor of Wales wrote a memorial that didn't mention England once. The British ambassador to Dublin didn't manage to mention the European Union, of which Ireland is a part, thank God. But the German got it right. He talked about Europe, the German ambassador. But I'm just putting it in the context because, well, I'll tell you there's a story about this. In all, about 35,000 Irishmen estimated to have been killed in the 1914-18 war. And almost 40 years ago, I travelled to Ypres with a young Irish woman, and she stood with me beneath the Menin Gate and stared in puzzlement at the 54,896 names of men who fought in my father's uniform, but whose bodies, of course, were never found. And looking at all those names, this young woman was moved by how many of them were Irish. Why in God's name, these were her words, she asked me, was a boy from the station house in Tralee dying here in Flanders? After a few minutes, here comes trouble by the way, an elderly man approached, holding a visitor's book. He asked if she would like to sign it. You realise this is the height of the war in Belfast. This was long before Ireland was a confident member of the European Union and able, in my view, to face up to this sacrifice of pre-independence soldiers. So my Irish friend looked at the British Army's insignia on the memorial book with considerable distaste. The crown glimmered on the cover in the evening light. They were about to play the last post at the Menin Gate. There wasn't much time to decide. But my friend could not forget the young man from Tralee. She was facing history, you see, which was not as easy and comforting and comprehensible for her as it can be for those of us who think we're always winning wars. In the end, she wrote in the book, in the Irish language, Dulciorta Bioga, for little countries. How carefully she eased the dead Irish soldiers' desire to help little Belgium, my dad's reason for going to war, into the memory of the tragedy of another little country. How she was able to conflate Ireland into Flanders without losing integrity. That was sharp. Time was running out. After the Great War, of course, as we know, German veterans responded in far more disturbing ways than Wyndham Lewis. I'm not going to mention the name of the corporal with the moustache, by the way, we all know. But here is Ernst Junger, his voice at the end of his First World War epic, Storm of Steel, which my dad gave to me. I have it in my library still. Today, we cannot understand the martyrs who threw themselves into the arena in a transport that lifted them even before their deaths beyond humanity. Watch out, I thought to myself when I read this. Beyond every phase of pain and fear, their faith no longer exercises a compelling force when once it is no longer possible to understand how a man gives his life to a country, and the time will come. Then all is over with that faith also, and the idea of the fatherland is dead. And then perhaps we shall be envied, as we envy the saints, their inward and irresistible strength. Oh God, I said to myself when I read that. This, I should add, is the same Junger who deified the Freikorps massacres of communists and Spartacists in Munich in 1919 by identifying each member of the Freikorps as the new man, the storm soldier, the elite of Mittel Europa, a completely new race, cunning, strong and purposeful. New forms must be moulded with blood, and power must be seized with a hard fist. There's another of the remains of the First World War for you. Interestingly, the Germans, and Hitler, once he came to power, now I've mentioned his wretched name, were absolutely transfixed by the Turkish regime of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. They built a lot of railway stations in independence Turkey because he had purified his race already with the Armenian Genocide. Hitler, the day before he invaded Poland, asked his generals, who now remembers the Armenians? See the direct line, straight again. World War I, Middle East, World War II. It's a true fact, by the way, if you don't know it, that many of the Germans military who were training the Turkish army in the First World War, and also diplomats from the German Foreign Office, witnessed the Armenian Genocide. They saw the men being taken away and the women being taken away with children. And some of those names of those young German officers and diplomats turn up later in Belarus in the Wehrmacht executing Jews. So you see again, World War I, Middle East, back. When Atatürk died, the Nazi Party newspaper Volkischer Beobachter ran the whole of its front page with a black rim in memory of Atatürk. Just remember that when you look at Turkish independence. And I suppose here a personal reflection is that having thought, and I've been thinking on the airplane coming here because I was going to talk to you, about war and how much I see around Iraq, Syria, Algeria, Bosnia, Serbia, NATO war in Serbia, I've come to the feeling, and you may disagree with me, and tell me if you do afterwards, but I've come to the feeling, the feeling that sorrow and sadness are dangerous addictions, like drugs or alcohol. I think this idea that mourning over sacrifice is something noble awakes somewhere in our dark human past something which is very dangerous. Another good reason why I don't want to wear a poppy, thank you very much. Which of course was based on a poem which was all about let's go and join the war. It was a pro-war poem, by the way, in Flanders Fields, by a Canadian of all people. And so I sort of think that a lot of wars can continue because we give nobility to sorrow and sadness. And we think of Rudyard Kipling trying to find where his son's body lay, trying to talk to everybody, to hunt down. My son Jack was a great TV player here, by the way. I had it sent to me in Beirut. We know of those fathers who constantly went to talk to soothsayers and ladies with big globes who would talk to their sons. What insanity. Thus the Great War, I think, in the words of its veterans, either gave their lives a sense of hopelessness, a vacuum of meaning and experience that would forever encourage them to avoid war, or in the case of men like Junger, a new kind of purpose forged in blood and pain that would necessitate yet another war in order to prove the worth of the First World War. No wonder that in 1919 Clemenceau said, all we've done is signed a ceasefire for 20 years. He got it spot on in 1939. Bill may have and did refuse to execute a soldier. By the way, the Australian was executed by another man. I checked the execution papers just in case Bill was pulling fast one on me. No, he told the truth. He did refuse. But Bill had less time for those who simply refused to fight or serve in the war. Conscientious objectors, my father used to call them conches, of course. After all, after dozens of postcards from his old Birkenhead school pals, some of which are those photographs I showed you, which you've looked at, he thought that fighting in the Third Battle of the Somme was a duty. He wasn't interested in men who wouldn't fight for their country. He gave me A.E.W. Mason's book, The Four Feathers, made into a rather lackluster film later on. You remember the hero is in the regiment before the Sudanese campaign, and he receives 3 white feathers for refusing to fight from his friends, and 1 white feather from his fiancée, of course. Bill wasn't trying to teach me lessons about cowardice. He just didn't want his son to be D.H. Lawrence, writing poetry while his compatriots died in the mud for his privilege to do so. Tell me, fella, Bill would say to me, if the Nazis were coming for your mum and dad, wouldn't you defend them? Wyndham Lewis, who I like more and more the more I read him, the guy with the red bird, reflecting on his desire to remain with his fellow soldiers at the front, found himself less inclined to immolate himself in defence of Mayfair. Being only concerned with the idea of deserting my companions in misfortune, he recalled Lytton Strachey before one of the Conscientious Objection Tribunal's judges, a man whose words prefigured my own father's argument. What, sternly asked one of the judges, would you do, Mr. Strachey, if you discovered a German preparing to outrage your sister? The Bloomsburys, this is Wyndham Lewis again, the Bloomsburys all exempted themselves in one way or another. Yet they had money and we hadn't, and ultimately it was to keep them fat and prosperous that other people were to risk their lives. Then there were the tales, says Wyndham Lewis, of how a certain famous artist of military age and military bearing would sit in the Café Royal and, addressing an admiring group back from the front, would exclaim, "We are the civilization for which you are fighting." I feel that's probably true. Yet who could disagree after the Great War, if not during its immense sacrifice? That's a word I'm beginning to hate. You know, it's interesting, the Syrian army, they're using the word sacrifice, martyrs, more and more. Same thing is going on. But who could disagree that the rules of war are a nonsense? forget for a moment, if you can, the Armenian Genocide. Tolstoy's devastating critique of Napoleon's invasion of Russia should be quoted here. We're talking War and Peace, of course. He wrote that, quote, war began. That is, an event took place opposed to human reason and to human nature. Millions of men perpetrated against one another such innumerable crimes, frauds, treacheries, thefts, incendiarisms and murders as in whole centuries are not recorded in the annals of all the law courts of the world, but which those who committed them did not at the time regard as being crimes at all. Because you've got purpose of war, haven't you? Again, through translation, Tolstoy too speaks our language. But what is happening to our language? Our generation, those of us like the soldiers of the Great War who lived in the age of handwriting and typewriters, and I'm not a Luddite, I'm glad people invent lenses for me to see through. We maintain the semantics of those who lived before us. For us, soldiers of the First World War do still speak to us as we might speak. Cast back in time, we might ourselves tonight go to Ypres of 1915 or 1917 and walk up to those soldiers and chat to them and understand every word they say to us. We understand through instinct the meaning of Blunden's houses whitely glimmering, Apollinaire's metaphor of mimosa in bloom, Asquith's poplars in a row. But I do fear, Fisk propaganda starts now, that we are permitting our wondrous technology, computers, to change our language. Ironically, I worry very much that the words of those who cry out to us from the first war of industrial technology will be erased from our comprehension by the technology of email, SMS, blogs, Twitters. I do notice when I am sent hard copies of emails, even when they are quoting poetry or citing passages of prose, that they're almost always ungrammatical, misspelled, abbreviated. There has been no revision. Owen and Sassoon constantly revised their poetry and their prose. All authors should do the same, but speed and brevity have overtaken the precision and discipline of writing, and in a world where even the names of our own towns here in England can lose their apostrophes, how can we preserve our contact with the past? It isn't just what we're learning of those who went before, it's whether we're going to stop learning. The distortion of language is not a solely English sin, as I'll come to. But I'll tell you a story that happened to me the other day. I was travelling from Paris to Beirut on an MEA Lebanese Airlines flight, and a woman was sitting next to me, reading a book on the First World War, a French book. By chance, I'd read it, and it's not very good, but it's a bloody great book, 600 pages. And by the time we reached Beirut, she was on page 512. And the flying time from Paris to Beirut is 4 hours, 45 minutes. And I watched her, and of course she was going. And then I realised, of course, she wasn't reading it, she was surfing the book. You see. Now, okay, in the suburbs of Paris, the Algerian community has already got a kind of argot in which they invert French words to show their contempt for the original French language. Hence the cops always call them the beurre, which is a version of Arabs backwards. Yet this is a code and it's simple to unscramble. Like artillery coordinates or, the vector to a Battle of Britain Spitfire, Angels 5 means 5,000 feet. It's not impossible to learn this kind of language. And I can see how the British soldiers, Ypres became wipers and Charleroi became Charlie Roy. It could even be used in an SMS. But this was out of a kind of weird affection rather than error. It is the sheer, almost willful failure to manage language rather than to control it, which is what we are allowing our mobile phones and messages to do. We all faced school examinations which demanded answers, quote, in not more than 400 words. I can't write stories for the Independent less than 400 words. But when told how many characters or how many alphabetical letters we may use in a Twitter, we've lost our freedom of expression. Increasingly, for example, I am being sent hard copy messages from which most verbs have been deleted. I got a letter after I wrote an impassioned Fisk piece about language from an address in Norfolk from a lady reader of The Independent. She wrote to me, and this is her actual letter. Due to the digital age, the meaning of language used by First World War writers may well become lost to the modern generation. This was illustrated to me recently when I gave a talk in Oxford to a group of teachers. My subject was Blunden's Undertones of War, his great prose epic on the First World War. Not many of the teachers had read my father's book, and some confessed to giving up reading it because it was too difficult to understand. Oxford teachers, for God's sake. My task that day was to help them with some of these difficulties and show them a way into reading Blunden's prose. I feel it is very important to encourage the modern reader to persevere, and perhaps in this world of instant gratification, this is a technique which will have to be taught. By the way, she finished, we share not only the same year of birth, 1946, but also the experience of being taken as children to battlefields of conflict by our fathers. Every good wish, Margie Blunden, the daughter. She got it right, didn't she? Verbs. Arafat used to leave out verbs, and that worried me. And I actually first became aware of the danger of leaving out verbs when I was enjoying a lunch which he paid for in Dublin with James Dillon, long dead now, alas, an opposition pro-British member of the Irish Dáil Éireann, Irish Parliament, who opposed Ireland's policy of neutrality in the Second World War, but who long before the war had supported the Irish equivalent of the Nazi brown shirts, led of course by a former Irish police commissioner, in his case called Owen O'Duffy. James Dillon, described to me the moment he realised that O'Duffy was a dangerous man in the 1930s. One day in West Cork, he told me, I was standing behind him on a balcony when he addressed a rally of several thousand young blue shirts. Many of the blue shirts, of course, had fought in the First World War in British uniform. O'Duffy was speaking very rapidly. It dawned on me that they were hanging on his words in a kind of obsessed way, and I suddenly realised that O'Duffy was speaking without verbs. It had no discernible meaning. And I remembered Hitler, he said. Go back to Junger again, the First World War German veteran. He might have approved of this verbless world, for it cuts us off not only from reality, but from our shared past. How in future will we interpret the glorious, fearful description of Ypres that Blunden wrote after the Great War? Over the sepulchral city, aeroplanes flew and fought in the cold winter sun. Sentries blew their whistles from broken archways. The brass shell cases used for gas gongs gleamed with a meaning beside them, and all of a sudden flights of shells came sliding into the town. Extraordinary expression, and very accurate, I can tell you. Those words will have to struggle for their place in a world where libraries of books have been abandoned for what our authorities must call language tools, screens rather than pages, surfing rather than deep reading. Books require reflection. Will we in another generation have to translate Blunden and Graves? This is Maggie Blunden's question, of course. In the same way as we need a sort of glossary for Chaucer's Middle English. Are the words of the Great War soldiers going to sound like Beowulf in Old English, an epic of war which now needs interpretation? Those dead battalions will have to fight to be heard in the future. Will we let them? Can they remain as imperishable as we would wish, or is their language to be as tattered as the paper upon which it was once written? Years ago, I found in Belfast a sad memento of the Somme. God, I've used sad and sacrifice, haven't I? The work of a Northern Ireland Protestant railwayman who fought in the Ulster Division, 36, and spent some of his time in the trenches of the Western Front, sticking newspaper clippings into his old railway notebook. Patriotic poetry and photographs of guns and armies, and political cartoons of a brutal Kaiser threatening the Virgin Belgium. Here's the book. It was in bits, and I had to in Beirut I put a new binding on here, but this is the original covers. And here are the books. There's even a picture of the capture of Jerusalem, just to remind me of the Middle East. Some of the cartoons are remarkably well drawn, by the way. Anyway, I stopped it falling to pieces, though the cover was flaking. But one article, this distant soldier, scissored from the paper, stands out. It's a report on the execution of Nurse Edith Cavell, shot by a German firing squad in Brussels on October 12, 1915, for helping up to 200 Allied airmen soldiers escape from occupied Belgium. The report, the anonymous Belfast soldier, left no indication of the newspaper in which it was printed, is remarkable for its lack of emotion. There, by the way, is the actual page. She stuck a photograph, 2 photographs of her in there. Obviously hit him hard. One of the newspaper's headlines is, "Died like a heroine, Nurse Cavell's last days, calm and resigned to the end. An atrocious crime, the blackest in history, scathing American comment." Thank God the Washington correspondent put something into it. Anyway, in this report, as they were, you have Cavell's last words, as they were recorded by the Reverend Gahan, presumably an Irishman, who was the British chaplain in Brussels. And now we all know the 4 words chiselled onto her monument near Trafalgar Square: patriotism is not enough. But these are merely a soundbite, an apparently pugnacious response to her killers, the SMS version of the truth. That's not what she meant. Here, according to the report in this old soldier's book from the trenches, is what she really said, in full and in context. "I have no fear nor shrinking. I have seen death so often that it is not strange or fearful for me. I thank God for this 10 weeks quiet. Life has always been hurried and full of difficulty. This time of rest has been a great mercy. They have all been very kind to me here. But this I would say, standing in view of God and eternity, I realise that patriotism is not enough. I must have no hatred or bitterness towards anyone." That's what she really said. And so I asked myself the final question over and over again. I've been doing this on the way here. Without the First World War, would we have had the Second? Or could we have won the Second World War without the First? And I was drawn inevitably back to a man who, because I suppose I wrote so much about Irish neutrality and Ireland, back to Churchill, who was not one of my heroes, but of course was one of my dads. And he gave a speech in May 1940, which is remarkably prescient at this very day, given the fact that we're heading for our own doomsday next year. Hitler knows that he must break us in this island or lose the war. If we stand up to him, all Europe may be free, and the lights of the world will move forward into broad, sunlit uplands. But if we fail, then the whole world, including the United States and all that we have known and cared for, will sink into the abyss of a new dark age. Ouch. Made more sinister and perhaps more prolonged by the lights of perverted science. No. Let us therefore address ourselves to our duty. Here we go. And so bear ourselves that if in 1,000 years' time men and women look back, and women, he didn't say women of course, they will always remember this was their finest hour. Just once, I always think, just once, in the history, we got it right at the right moment and we won. Battle Britain. There you go. And I suppose if we started with, the Armenian Genocide, General Haig, Lloyd George, Bill Fisk, Churchill, and now I think we're in the run-up the last 12 months. God spare me to Brexit. What a vorticist artist would make of that leap? And all I can say to you, frankly, as I thank you for your patience in listening to me today, are 5 words as we go from World War I to Theresa May. Good night and good luck. Thank you very much.